Welcome back to Boilers and Beyond. I am your host, Jordan Jones. I'm recording this on Sunday as I won't be able to record on Tuesday like a usual week. So if any big news takes place between now and Tuesday when I upload this episode, just know I'll get to it on the next show. I'll tweet about it on the Twitter account at Boilers Beyond, but we won't have an episode about it this week. I won't have my recording equipment with me, so we'll get to it in the future. Finally, this week, we had a big week full of news in college athletics, both with Purdue and just looking across the country at what's going on in college athletics there. So we'll recap this week, some of the news that took place, and then we'll discuss a little bit about the name, image, and likeness compensation that has been approved and the one-time transfer rule, which has not yet been approved, but figures to be approved at some point coming up here in the next year or so. Earlier this week, Mitch Daniels announced in a coronavirus task force meeting that Ross-Ade Stadium is not planning to exceed 25% capacity this year. Ross-Ade Stadium has roughly 57,000 seats, so you're looking at between 14 and 15,000 people in the stadium under the current plan that Mitch Daniels has laid out. I have a tough time believing at this point that 25% is the ceiling. I think 25% is going to be closer to the floor. Look, it's a money game. Purdue football and Purdue men's basketball cover the expenses for Purdue's 17 other varsity sports. Purdue can't afford to be losing the income that comes with having Ross-Ade Stadium as full as possible on 6 or 7 Saturdays in the fall. And I think now with looking at a 25% capacity, that begs the question, who are those 14 to 15,000 people who are allowed to come in the stadium? Is it John Purdue Club members? Is it students? Is it everyone who had bought a season ticket thus far? Those are going to be big questions for Athletic Director Mike Babinski and the Athletic Ticket Office staff to come up with answers for. I have a tough time believing that students will be prioritized over John Purdue Club members. Now, I do also believe that before we get to football season, into training camp, and certainly by the time we get to September 12th when Purdue plays their first home game of the year against Memphis, I really have a tough time believing that we're going to see only 25% of Ross-Ade full. I think you're going to see these numbers start to get released around the country, but I'm hopeful that we can start to see some decreases in this virus, and we're going to see, the percent capacity at stadiums across the country increase. So it will be interesting, though, to see, should 25% be what takes place, who are those 25% of people? I mean, you have a lot of people in John Purdue Club who donate quite a bit of money to Purdue Athletics. I can't imagine them being thrilled with being left out of Ross-Ade Stadium on Saturdays in the fall in favor of Purdue students. Obviously, there's a lot to be seen here and a lot to be determined, but it will be an interesting storyline to follow, particularly for me and my friends, as we're all seniors at Purdue. This will be our last season as students in the student section, so obviously wanting to get back into Ross-Ade in person, but at the same time, I am maintaining a very realistic expectation here that I do think John Purdue Club members can, will, and probably should be the priority for Purdue Athletics here. Mitch Daniels also added in that meeting that they do not know or have any plans related to the capacity for Mackey Arena this year, which makes sense. Obviously, we are a long way away from basketball, which will tip off on November 10th against Evansville. But, it is worth at least thinking about. Obviously, it's been well documented that this virus does not do particularly well outside, but it transmits much easier in indoor settings. Obviously, Mackey Arena, you have 14,000 people very closely packed in. It's not the most spacious arena. And when you look at student seating, the students are all really close together. And even up in the general public seating, with the exception of the chairbacks on the opposite side of the benches, it's all bleacher seating, and that gets people pretty closely packed in there. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Purdue basketball, because I could see that being a environment where it is just students. That would make more sense to me than an environment like football, where students are prioritized over John Purdue Club members. I don't see that one flying in football as much as I could basketball. On the topic of Purdue basketball, this week it was announced officially by the Purdue basketball social media accounts that Purdue will be facing Yale in between Christmas and the New Year on December 29th. Yale, a very solid team out of the Ivy League. You remember a couple years back, they upset Baylor in the first round of the NCAA Tournament. They've been in contention in the Ivy League pretty much every year that I can remember. Another solid opponent for Purdue to be playing. And again, it just shows Matt Painter's commitment to really playing a difficult non-conference schedule, because even when they schedule lower level, the mid-major programs, Matt Painter is still scheduling a lot of the teams that are contending for conference titles and really making a push at some teams in the Big Dance most years. So good team for Purdue to be playing from a strength of schedule perspective. This now leaves us with only the Big Ten ACC Challenge and the Gavitt game to be announced for Purdue's schedule this year. Usually those are announced in June. Now, I don't know how that's going to be impacted this year with the virus and with the NBA early entry deadline. Usually that has already come and gone by this point. Now we are seeing August 3rd as the latest date for players to withdraw their name from the NBA draft. We have a long way to go to get there. And I think it's really important that these matchups aren't determined until we know who's staying and going. You always see these games, they try to match up the marquee teams with the marquee teams. Well, in the Big Ten, this really, really has extraordinary impacts on two teams particularly, and that's Iowa and Illinois. With Iowa, they should have a pretty solid group this year, but Luka Garza, his decision to return is going to alter the entire landscape of college basketball this year, should he come back. If he does decide to return to Iowa City, you're going to see Iowa be a top 10, potentially a top 5 team in the country preseason, whereas if Luka Garza doesn't return, I think you see Iowa in that receiving votes category for the top 25. And then with Illinois, obviously Kofi Cockburn and Ayo Dosunmu both are in the draft pool right now. Should they decide to leave, that really lowers expectations for Illinois in the same way that it would for Iowa if Garza decides to leave. Dosunmu and Kofi Cockburn were both very, very strong players for the Illini last year as Illinois swept Purdue in 2 games that really were not all that close. Illinois flat out manhandled Purdue last year. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, if those guys come back, you're going to see Illinois, in my opinion, probably as a top 15 to top 20 team in America preseason. And they're going to be talked about as, maybe the second best team in the Big Ten behind Iowa. Should Kofi Cockburn and Ayo Dosunmu leave, you're going to see them slide down the middle of the pack of the Big Ten probably, and not a preseason top 25 team nationally. Purdue offered a tremendous amount of 2022 basketball players this week. I think we are now up to 10 total players offered in the 22 class. There are 4 scholarships available that year. I know it's sometimes weird to look into the future at what scholarships will be opening, but those scholarships, the 4 scholarships available, will be replacing Aaron Wheeler, Trevion Williams, Sasha Stefanovic, and Eric Hunter Jr. Again, it's very, very weird to think about those guys graduating, but so is the nature of recruiting. You have to look well into the future, and Purdue is looking for 4 players to fill those gaps. Only 2 of the offers so far to in-state players. That would be 2 wing players, 6'8" forward Jalen Washington from Gary West High School, and 6'6" forward Deontay Davis from Lawrence Central High School. Both of those players are fairly highly recruited, particularly Washington, who suffered an ACL injury last year at Gary West, but is a very highly regarded member of the 2022 class. Purdue offered him long ago, whereas Davis was just offered recently here in the past few days. You were seeing these players being offered from all across the country. And I think that's saying a lot more about the 2022 class in the state of Indiana than it is Purdue's focus in recruiting. I think Purdue has always made it very clear that, they prioritize the state of Indiana in recruiting. This is the best basketball state in America. You get great players out of this state, and that really ignites the fan base. You see this both with Purdue and Indiana. The fan bases latch on to the Indiana kids like no other. And, unfortunately for Purdue this year, just the 2022 class in Indiana doesn't seem to have an abundance of Division I or high major caliber players the way some past classes have. So they're going far and wide. Now, almost every player offered is a top 100. I think the only one that might not be is Fletcher Lawyer from the state of Michigan. He's the younger brother of Michigan State guard Foster Lawyer. So I believe he is the only player not in the top 100. I could be wrong there, but Purdue's offering very highly regarded players in this class, and obviously with 4 scholarships available, they're going to hit the ground running on this class because there's only 1 open scholarship left for that 2021 group. So it'll be interesting to see, how much Purdue pushes these kids and, when they're able to land their first commitment for the 2022 class. We did see in news beyond Purdue this week, Oklahoma State basketball earned a postseason ban for the 2020-2021 school year. They will not be eligible to play in the NCAA Tournament due to punishments from improper benefits and the bribery cases having to do with the FBI investigation. This is obviously a very, very harsh punishment to a program that is not considered to be a blue blood of college basketball. That has been a common knock of people against the NCAA, is that the NCAA punishes the blue blood programs a little bit more leniently than they do the non-blue blood programs. With Kansas and with Louisville and with Arizona likely facing some potential new charges coming up, it'll be interesting to see how the NCAA translates this punishment to Oklahoma State. Now, the very significant part of Oklahoma State's 2021 tournament ban is that they landed the number 1 recruit in the country for the 2020 recruiting class, Cade Cunningham, likely to be a top 5 pick at least in the NBA draft next year after his freshman season. He will not be allowed to play in the NCAA tournament this year. Oklahoma State was able to earn his signature on the letter of intent after hiring his brother as an assistant coach. Obviously, an interesting storyline there, to say the least, but no Cade Cunningham in the NCAA tournament this year. That is a very, very disappointing thing for college basketball, which obviously tries to get its top players in the limelight as much as possible. We have seen with football players beginning to return to campuses, players testing positive for COVID-19, as pretty much every program is requiring health screenings for their players once they return. We have seen Alabama, Oklahoma State, and Iowa State announce positive tests for some of their student athletes who have returned to campus. I believe all of these guys have been asymptomatic for COVID-19, but they have tested positive. This is going to be an interesting thing to follow all summer, because how schools handle this will say a lot about the upcoming year. I don't know what to expect necessarily, but, if a player tests positive for COVID-19, do they have to sit out for 14 days in quarantine? That could be unbelievably consequential for the upcoming football season. In Purdue's case, what do you do if a quarterback or, one of the star wide receivers tests positive? That impacts things greatly. And I think this impacts the gambling spectrum more than anything. It's been very well publicized that for college football bettors like myself and many others who enjoy betting on college football, coaches don't often release injury news until right before kickoff. So how publicized will COVID positive test results be? If you're betting on a game and you find out that, if you're betting on week 1, Central Florida versus North Carolina, and you find out that Sam Howell tested positive, that impacts your bet. That's a 3-point line swing potentially to have a backup quarterback in there. So it's going to be really interesting to see how transparent the test results are with the media and with the public during football season. Purdue football athletes return to campus this week. Hopefully there are no positive tests for Purdue players. I don't know what to really expect there. Obviously, these are not mandatory team workouts at this point, but players can begin to return and begin to do things in the weight room at this point and get ready for the upcoming football season. A tremendous step in the right direction, and a step that should have everyone getting excited for Boilermaker football. We are now less than 13 weeks away, less than 90 days away from Purdue football up in Lincoln, Nebraska for the season opener on September 5th. Now, that's kind of all for the news we have. We'll move into today's topics. Name, image, and likeness rules have been approved by the NCAA. They will take effect in the fall of 2021. This is significant. Obviously, for the first time now, players are allowed to be compensated for their name, image, and likeness, meaning they can make money off of who they are. This has previously been very much against the rules by the NCAA, as we have seen high-level athletes really hurt by this. One that stands out to me was Todd Gurley getting suspended in the middle of a Heisman Trophy run for selling his autograph when he was at the University of Georgia. That will no longer be a suspendable offense. That is now legal. So this is a pretty good step, in my opinion. I am a fairly traditional college sports fan who, obviously, I do not support the payment of players straight from the athletic department, but I do think it is fair that these players are able to make money off of who they are. What's going to be interesting for me and for many others is to see, is there a limit set on how much a player can make? I don't know what the demand is going to be for college athletes as a marketing tool or as a promotional item. For example, obviously when Zion Williamson was at Duke, his earning potential was tremendous, as he was by far the biggest player in college basketball that year, and quite honestly, one of the biggest names in basketball at either the college or the professional level, just in general. Zion Williamson was a massive name. But look at this past year. Who was the face of college basketball this past year? I think that's a really difficult question to answer. Was it Obi Toppin at Dayton? Was it Luka Garza in Iowa? Was it someone at a blue blood like Cole Anthony at North Carolina, who was just a horrible team last year? Was it Vernon Carey at Duke, who didn't really make big waves with what he did despite having a solid year? That face of college basketball wasn't as present this past year. And if you look at college football, sure, Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields are massive names, but who else is capable of getting that big money? You look at one of the top players in the country, Penei Sewell from Oregon, he's an offensive lineman. Is there demand for offensive linemen's endorsements? Is it just a quarterback and skill position player deal where people are going to be wanting those players to endorse products, but not as much the offensive linemen or the linebackers or the defensive tackles? I don't know what to expect from this. It's going to be really interesting to see on a national level what the demand is like. And even at the local level, it's going to be interesting to see. I think as a Purdue fan, what all in Lafayette is going to be willing to pay college athletes for their endorsement or for a commercial? Are we going to see, Lafayette restaurants paying a player like an Aaron Wheeler or a George Karlaftis to endorse their restaurant, a car dealership, anything? Are we going to see a tremendous amount of players getting money for this? At that point, how much money is actually in it? I don't know the answer to that. I would love to find out. I would love to know, should University Bookstore at Purdue decide to get Brandon Newman on a commercial saying, I get my textbooks at University Bookstore, you should too. What kind of money is actually in that? I can't imagine it's going to be a tremendously valuable commodity. I could be wrong, but it's going to be really interesting to see what the demand is at the college level. I do think, however, the one area that's getting really undercovered in this name, image, and likeness approval conversation is players being able to accept endorsements in their hometown. You see, obviously for a player, from an urban area or a metropolitan area like Indianapolis or Chicago, there's not going to be as big of a demand for those players because the quantity is abundant. There's many players in college basketball from the city of Indianapolis. But if you look at a Purdue perspective, you get a player like Dakota Mathias a few years ago, who's from Elida, Ohio. It's a small town. It's a suburb of Lima, Ohio, which is not tremendously big in its own. I think the earning potential for Dakota Mathias in Elida would have to be very interesting to look at because, it's not like Elida, Ohio was a basketball factory. Mathias is a notable player to come out of there and obviously had a very, very strong Purdue career. What would his earning potential be like to go sponsor Elida Body Parts or, Elida Bar and Grill? I don't know what to necessarily think of that, but it's going to be interesting to find out. It'll be interesting to see, too, what can athletes sponsor? Can an athlete who is 21 years old sponsor alcohol or sponsor a bar? I don't know the answer to any of these questions, but it would seem like that is something that needs to be decided on. At Ross-Ade Stadium last year, in the north end zone ribbon board, there was a Coors Light ad all year long. Now, if Coors Light can sponsor Purdue Athletics and Purdue Athletics can put up Coors Light advertisements, can a senior football player who's 22 years old have some type of an endorsement deal with Coors Light or a local brewery or any alcoholic company or a bar? Any of this stuff where alcohol is involved, can players sponsor that? You look at states where marijuana is legal, I wouldn't think that that's allowed, as it's still banned by the NCAA, but, I don't know. I just don't know what to expect with this, and I think there are still a lot of questions to be answered by the fall of 2021 when this takes effect. Some other things are, where is the impact between big and small schools? Can you make more money at a small school by being the star than you could be at a big school by being the role player? That's one that I wonder. I just don't know the answers to a lot of these questions. And obviously, for people my age and in my generation, the big question we all want to know, is there potential for the NCAA football video game series to come back? I know I hope so. I have been playing way too much NCAA 2014 on the PlayStation 3 during this quarantine period. I am ready for a new NCAA football video game to come out, even if we are now, next month will be 7 years removed from the release of NCAA 14. Suddenly I feel very old. There's so much left to be answered about the name, image, and likeness rule being passed, but, props to the NCAA. They approved it. They are looking to Congress now to help get laws passed in, the U.S. Senate to really promote name, image, and likeness and make it fully legal. The NCAA has done a good job on this, even if, you can make the argument that they are years or even decades too late on this. The other piece of legislation that has been around the NCAA during 2020 has been the one-time transfer rule, which would allow athletes in football, men's basketball, baseball, and I believe women's basketball to transfer one time during their career without having to sit out a year. Obviously, right now, the system is not working. A player can transfer at any time and apply for a waiver through the NCAA for immediate eligibility, sometimes with success, sometimes with no success, and it really makes very little sense when the NCAA decides to grant a waiver and when they don't. A couple of the times where they have granted waivers and it just hasn't made any sense, you look at Tate Martell going from Ohio State to Miami because he got beat out. Did he deserve immediate eligibility because Dwayne Haskins beat him out? I don't think so. At Justin Fields' perspective, he wasn't playing behind Jake Fromm at Georgia much. He transfers to Ohio State and is given immediate eligibility. Does that make sense? I don't think so, but obviously the NCAA did. And that significantly altered the college football landscape last year. Ohio State made it to the playoff. Ohio State was very, very close to playing for a national championship. They lost a close game to Clemson in the semifinal. These decisions being made are having massive consequences for the on-field landscape, but aren't made with much consistency at all. So I think it's really important that the NCAA figures out a better system for this. Obviously, the graduate transfer rule is in place now too, and has become probably the most abused rule in all of sports. It really has only been popular for about a decade now. I think the most high-profile first case of this was Russell Wilson transferring from North Carolina State to Wisconsin for his last year of college eligibility, where he had a really, really good year at Wisconsin and has translated that into a really, really successful professional football career. Over the past decade, it's grown and grown. Obviously, we've seen at Purdue, especially with Purdue basketball, a number of these players being taken. Eric Peck, Sterling Carter, John Octius, Johnny Hill, Jihad Proctor, Evan Boudreaux, Spike Albrecht. I may be missing someone in there, but they've had a lot of players who have been graduate transfers in college basketball come into Purdue. We've also seen players leave as graduate transfers. Jaquil Taylor, Matt Harms, the two most recent ones. There's a lot of graduate transfer stuff going on that I don't always know is in the best interest of the sport. Part of what makes March Madness in college basketball what it is the upsets, the small school Cinderella teams that make a run. And you can look at the teams who make runs. They're often senior-led. They're experienced teams with players who have been together for a while. A one-time transfer rule really hurts that. If you get a player who is in the Missouri Valley Conference and is an all-conference level player scoring 15 points a game, is he going to stay at a school like a Loyola or a Drake, or is he going to bounce and go to a Big East school or a Big Ten school? Is he going to go to a Marquette or a Northwestern instead where he can play on a bigger stage? I think that's a really big issue with this one-time transfer rule, and I think it's going to lead to coaches having to recruit their own players still. I don't know, in Purdue's case, Purdue's redshirted a lot of players over the years in basketball. Would Matt Painter still have to be recruiting those players to stick around, even though they're not playing as freshmen? In football's case, it's different because there's so many players, but you see a lot of quarterbacks transferring around. Will that extend out to skill position players or offensive linemen who want to go from, a group of 5 school up to the Power 5 level to show themselves off against bigger competition? All of these questions are really important, and I think this is why the coaches have continued to punt this rule and the vote on this rule back. Now we won't see any decision on this until the calendar turns to 2021. Personally, I'm not in favor of this. However, I do think it will likely pass at some point. We'll obviously follow anything related to the one-time transfer rule, whether new pieces of the actual legislation are released or any discussion about the likelihood of it passing. When that stuff becomes available, we'll discuss it on here. So be sure to subscribe. That way you get all the updates on the one-time transfer rule. To conclude the episode today, we got one question from the audience, and that is, what will the over-under be in Purdue versus Memphis, and how much should I put on the over? Great question. Obviously, when you're looking at over-unders, you have to start thinking about what a reasonable score in a football game is. And, I think if you look at an over-under for that game, obviously it's going to be high. Purdue's defense has not proven to be too stout. Missouri has a high-flying offense, and Purdue should have a high-flying offense this year, assuming that Rondale Moore, David Bell, Milton Wright, all of these guys out on the outside are healthy, and that Jack Plummer or Aiden O'Connell or Austin Burton, whoever's under center, can get the ball to them in space. I think the over-under is at least in the mid-60s for this game. A 35-28 score would be a total of 63. I think that is a very realistic expectation for this game. And if you told me, it would be a 42-35 or a 45-42, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised. And that's getting those scores up, into the 70s and 80s. I think the over-under will probably be in the upper 60s for this game. Obviously, you can't bet it yet from anywhere I've seen. Looking at sports books, whether it's FanDuel or DraftKings or 5 Dimes, I don't see a lot of Purdue lines up already. I've seen some projected lines courtesy of Brad Powers, but, I don't know that I've seen an over-under for that game yet. But it'll be high, and we'll see after week 1 what to see with Purdue's offense this year. I do think the over will probably be a good play in that game, but also, obviously, as most Purdue fans are hoping that Bob Diaco's defense can be a little bit stouter this year and make a really good improvement in his first year, the way Nick Holt's defense was really strong in his first year at Purdue, coming in with Jeff Brom. Thank you for tuning into the show today. Make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure you do this so that you can get every new episode of Boilers and Beyond. Give the show a follow on Twitter at Boilers Beyond. Let me know what you thought of this week's episode. I love getting feedback from the audience. Let me know what you want me to talk about in the future. Obviously, we have 12 more weeks until Purdue football kicks off. That's a lot of time to discuss some topics. So if you have anything you want to hear me talk about, let me know. We'll be back next Tuesday for more of the biggest news and high-level analysis of Purdue Athletics, so be sure to tune in. Until then, stay safe.